You do not have to knit a knitting project exactly the same way the knitting pattern tells you. And today I'm going to teach you how to make one of the easiest changes that you can make to customize a knitting project to your specific wishes. Welcome back to the Apiary and Knitting Podcast. My name is Lauren, if we hadn't met. I design knitting patterns, primarily accessories, with a special focus on socks. And today we're talking about ribbing. Ribbing serves a whole bunch of different functions in the knitting world, but you may not always like the ribbing that is included in a knitting pattern for any one of a number of reasons. Today we'll be talking about how to identify a good ribbing for your knitting project, how to swap out different ribbings, and which types of ribbing are best suited for different purposes. But first, let's back up for the newer knitters among us. What is ribbing in the first place? Ribbing is essentially stacks of knit stitches next to stacks of purl stitches in varying intervals. You might have 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches, 3 knit stitches and 1 purl stitch, 3 purl stitches and 2 knit stitches. There are all different ways that you can kind of mix up that combination, but you want relatively short numbers of each type of stitch, relatively few numbers. What that does is, because of the difference in how knit stitches and purl stitches are structured, is it creates a kind of rippled fabric that is very stretchy and then stretches back into place. So you can pull it out and then it'll stretch back into place when it's done, almost like a piece of elastic. But again, sometimes a knitting pattern might use one type of ribbing and you may not like that type of ribbing. Maybe you want to use something else. So I'm going to walk you through my 3-step process for figuring out what changes I can make and whether I should make them when I'm looking at the ribbing on a pattern. Step 1 is to think about what purpose the ribbing is serving in this particular knitting pattern, because ribbing serves all sorts of potential functions, right? So here are some of the most common things that ribbing is doing in a knitting pattern. First, sometimes it's just interesting texture. You might have a garment that has ribbing all over it just because it looks nice. It creates visual interest and it's a little more fun to knit than just plain stockinette. Sometimes the ribbing is there to prevent the rest of the knitting piece from rolling in on itself. This is particularly common when you have pieces that are heavy in stockinette stitches, where stockinette tends to have a tendency to curl, right? It curls under onto itself. And so if you have a ribbing border or ribbing at the top and the bottom, that can help prevent that curling. Sometimes ribbing is also used to improve the fit of an item that's supposed to be snug against the body. So my favorite example is socks. Socks should be tight on your feet. But sometimes, depending on the variations in foot shapes, there might be points where a plain stockinette sock might be loose in one spot and tight in another. If you have some kind of basic ribbing running up and down the sock, say 5 knits and a purl or 4 knits and a purl going up and down the whole length of the sock, that gives you some kind of additional elasticity, some stretch in the sock that can improve the fit in different areas. Ribbing also is used to hold things in place. So again, another classic example of this is a sock cuff. If you don't have that ribbing there, sock cuffs tend to slouch and droop. But because of that stretchiness, that elasticity in the ribbing, it can help hold the sock leg up around your calf where you like to keep it. That's kind of the most frequent example, but you'll also see it in other places like hot water bottle covers and tea cozies. And finally, the last most common use for ribbing that I see is closing off drafty areas in a garment where that garment is meant to be worn in very cold weather and you don't want wind blowing into it. So think of long sleeve cuffs where they're nice and tight against your wrists. Also turtlenecks, right? They tend to be ribbed and kind of snug up against the neck so that the wind doesn't get down into your sweater and turn your whole sweater into a giant wind tunnel. Once you've identified the purpose that the original ribbing is serving, you can now start evaluating whether your potential ribbing that you want to use is a good swap for the original ribbing that you don't like or don't want to use. So step 2 of that process is to evaluate the stretchiness of the original ribbing and the ribbing that you want to substitute. Different types of ribbing are more stretchy than other types. So a 2x2 ribbing, which is where you have 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 knits, 2 purls all the way along, is very, very stretchy. It's a great stretchy ribbing. A 1x1 ribbing, where you have 1 knit and 1 purl, 1 knit and 1 purl, is also quite stretchy, but not as stretchy as a 2x2 ribbing. When you start changing the balance between knit and purl stitches, if you have more knit stitches or more purl stitches, then you reduce the elasticity of the ribbing. So let's go back to that sock example I mentioned earlier. If you have 4 knit stitches and 1 purl stitch, that'll give you some additional stretch, but it won't be as stretchy and then go back into place as a 2x2 ribbing would be. And so generally, the greater the imbalance between your knit and purl stitches, the less stretch your ribbing will have. And then at a certain point, you will reach a point where you have too many knit stitches and too many purl stitches in a row, and then the ribbing doesn't really function as ribbing anymore. I would, generally speaking, not go beyond 4 knit stitches without a purl following it, or 4 purl stitches without a knit stitch afterward. If your original ribbing and your intended substitute ribbing have relatively equal levels of stretch, or you understand the original purpose of the original knitting and you're comfortable with the different level of stretch in your new knitting, then the third question you want to ask yourself is, which cast on or bind off do you want to use? Because there are some cast on or bind off methods that work better with certain types of ribbing than with others. My favorite example is the tubular cast on and the Italian bind off. Both of those are designed to work best with 1x1 ribbing. 1 knit, 1 purl, 1 knit, 1 purl. You can make adjustments to work both the cast on and the bind off with a 2x2 ribbing, but it does require some setup rounds and a little fussing and fidgeting. And so if you're not interested in doing that, you might be better off just using a 1x1 ribbing. I'll be honest too, that as much as I have tried, I have never quite been able to get my Italian bind off to look as smooth when I take a 2x2 ribbing and reposition it for that bind off technique. There's always a stretched stitch on the side. There are things you can do to, kind of tug things and pull them into place and make it look less obvious. But for me, I think I would rather just work a 1x1 rib all the way and then not have to work setup rows and not have to do the adjusting at the end if I want to use that particular bind off. So those are the 3 questions I always ask myself when I'm thinking about swapping out one ribbing for another. Is I look at the original ribbing in the pattern and I ask myself, what is that ribbing doing? What is the function it serves in this pattern? Then I look at the original ribbing and my intended substitute ribbing and I ask myself, how stretchy are these 2 ribbings? Are they compatible with each other? And then third, I ask myself, what kind of cast on or bind off do I want to use? And is that compatible with either the original ribbing or the ribbing that I want to use? Now let's take a look at some different kinds of ribbing and what different scenarios I like to use those different kinds in. So first, we're going to look at a 1x1 twisted ribbing. I'll hold this up a little closer so you can see it. You can see here, this is 1 knit through the back loop, 1 purl, 1 knit through the back loop, 1 purl, 1 knit through the back loop, 1 purl. So this ribbing method is very popular because it has similar stretch to a 1x1 ribbing, but it is much easier to get a consistent stitch tension. A lot of people struggle with loose or tugged knit stitches when they are doing a 1x1 ribbing. And so if you find that you are having trouble with getting your stitch tension nice and even in a 1x1 ribbing, a 1x1 twisted rib where you knit 1 through the back loop and purl 1 might be a good choice for you. I find that the 1x1 twisted rib is a little bit less stretchy than the regular 1x1 rib. I don't think for most projects that difference is enough to make a huge difference. It's just something to keep in mind. If you are working on a project where your 1x1 ribbing is just exactly the right size and you really can't handle losing any stretch there, then you should keep that in mind if you are thinking about switching to a 1x1 twisted rib. So speak of the devil, let's talk about a regular 1x1 rib. And that's this guy here. I have used this on the top and bottom of this cowl here. And you can see here, it's just a plain knit stitch and a plain purl stitch and a plain knit stitch and a plain purl stitch. And I've done that on the top and on the bottom here. Now, I have not used any special cast on or bind off here. You could definitely do a tubular cast on and an Italian bind off if you wanted to, and you would get some additional stretch at the edge. I wanted to have a little more stiffness because the function that the ribbing is serving here in this cowl is not so much having to do with getting extra stretch anywhere, but really has to do with A, preventing the cowl from rolling in on itself, and B, adding a little bit of structure to the top and bottom of the cowl because I don't want it to be too floppy. So the ribbing helps kind of close in the top of the cowl a little bit, keep it a little snugger and a little more warm. And so that stiffer cast on and bind off is helpful to avoid too much additional stretch. I like a good 1x1 rib on sock cuffs as well. Your mileage may vary, your preference may vary, that's okay. Now the 2x2 rib is what you can see here on this sock cuff. I'll hold that up a little closer for you. That is where you have 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches and 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. And the 2x2 rib is a classic for sock cuffs for a reason. It is a wonderfully elastic, stretchy rib. It stretches way out and bounces right back into place, which is great because when you are putting on your socks, you need to pull them up over your heel, right? And that has a significantly larger circumference than your ankle for most sock wearers. That means that this part needs to stretch out quite a bit to get up and over your heel, but then needs to go back in place and be a little bit elastic and a little bit snug so that it stays held up against your calf. Because of that stretchiness, the 2x2 rib is super versatile and you see it all over the place. You see it on necklines, you see it on sleeve cuffs, you see it on hems, you see it on hat brims. It's a great, very versatile, very stretchy ribbing. Because it is so popular, a lot of people get tired of working it after a while and think it's kind of boring. Your mileage may vary. Again, know yourself, know your preferences as a knitter. For me, sometimes classic is exactly what I want. So sometimes a 2x2 ribbing is what I will add onto my sock cuffs. All right, the next few types of ribbing I'm going to show you are just straight up swatches because I don't have these in projects at the moment. And the first is this one. This is fisherman's rib. And fisherman's rib is not a particularly stretchy rib. You get a little bit of motion here, but not really more than in regular stockinette. The thing about fisherman's rib is A, it's visually very interesting to look at. B, it's very warm. If I hold this up closer here, you can see these stitches have extra strands of yarn between them. And that's because on every other stitch, you are knitting into the stitch below and essentially creating a double layer of warmth in that fabric. So fisherman's rib is great for hats, for scarves, for sweaters, where you really want a nice, thick, warm fabric, but you want something with a little bit of stretch in it too. Because it doesn't stretch as much as the other ribs, I would not use fisherman's rib for something like a sock cuff. Our next example is broken rib. And broken rib is created by knitting one row plain, and then on the next row, you knit one, purl one all the way across. And then you knit one row plain, and then you knit one, purl one all the way across. And what that does, and when I let go of this swatch, you're gonna see there's an imbalance of knit and purl stitches. There are way more knit stitches here. And so this fabric is trying to curl in onto itself, which means if you are using ribbing to try and prevent stockinette fabric from curling in on itself, this is not your winner. You do not want to use this one. Also, hi, I haven't actually woven in the ends on any of these swatches. I'm just cleverly hiding them behind the swatches. Anyway, this is another great ribbing for things like garments, loose-fitting garments, really comfortable, squishy scarves. I also like it for hems on the bottom of a heavy garment where you don't necessarily want the hem tight against your body. It's really there for when you want just some weight and some heft to keep the garment hanging nice and straight. In that case, this is a great ribbing for the bottom of like a knit t-shirt, right? So you would do the hem and maybe the sleeves as well in this kind of broken rib. And finally, we have mistake rib. I'm gonna hold that up nice and close so you can see it. Mistake rib is also sometimes known as seed rib, I learned recently. And it is, unlike the other two, pretty stretchy. It's not quite as stretchy as a regular ribbing, like a 2x2 or a 1x1, but it's pretty stretchy. I still wouldn't use this one for like a cuff on a sweater where I really need it to stay nice and close to my wrist because I'm going out in, minus 20 degrees. But for other purposes, like for a looser fitting sleeve cuff, that might be okay, right? I probably wouldn't use it for a sock cuff. Maybe not for a hat brim, right? Those are things that really do need to be kind of tight against the body. But for looser hems and cuffs, great fit. Also great for sweaters, great for like an overall sweater texture, and great for scarves. So there's a look at my 6 favorite types of ribbing that I use a lot. Again, I only have swatches of these ones because most of the projects I've done with these are in heavy use, and so they're kind of grimy looking at this point, but that's okay. If you have other types of ribbing that you love using, I would love to hear about them in the comments because I am always interested in swatching new stitch techniques and seeing how they compare to other types that I have used before. So please let me know if there are other types of ribbing that you really enjoy working. And otherwise, thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time. Happy stitching.